Mark Sanborn, welcome to the Mindset Advantage podcast. I've been listening to your content for many, many years, somebody that I really look up to in the speaking space. I'm so glad that you're here today. Thank you for carving time out of your busy schedule.
Well, my pleasure. Your dad and I have been friends for many, many years, and it's great to be talking with you on this podcast now.
Where I would like to start is actually back in time. Take me back to 1988 in Denver, Colorado, when you got a knock on your front door.
I moved to Denver in 1987 from Philadelphia. I had started speaking full time in 1986. I wasn't sure how that was going to work out. I thought if it didn't, I'd move to Cozumel and be a dive master and eat shrimp and drink beer all day long when I wasn't scuba diving. That didn't happen. I kept speaking, and I moved to Denver, bought my first house in 1988. It was about a 950 square foot bungalow in an area of Denver called Washington Park. And I'd lived there, I don't know, a couple, 3 days when there's a knock on the front door. I opened the front door and standing there's a relatively short fellow. He's probably 5'3", 5'4". He's wearing a blue-gray uniform, carrying a bag. And he says, "Good afternoon, Mr. Sanborn. My name is Fred. I am your postman. I just stopped by to say welcome to the neighborhood and introduce myself and find out a little bit about you and what you do for a living." Now, I've been receiving mail all my adult life. And even though I'd waved at the postal carrier, I never really met him or her personally. So this was a first. And I said, "Fred, I'm a professional speaker." And he said, "Well, you must travel a lot." Now, back then, I was doing about 220 days a year on the road. And I told him that. He said, "Great. If you'll just give me your calendar so that I know when you're in town, I'll hold your mail for you. I'll bundle it. I'll only deliver it on the days that you're here to receive it." Now, I'd never had a choice of a la carte mail service before either. And I said, "Fred, that's really not necessary. I've got a mailbox nailed here by the front door. Just leave the mail in the box. I'll pick it up when I come back into town." Fred says, "Mr. Sanborn, let me point out, burglars watch for mail in the box. If your box is full of mail, they know you're gone. It increases the likelihood that you'll get robbed." He said, "Here's what I'd recommend instead." He said, "I'll be glad to put mail in your box as long as the lid closes. That way nobody will know that you're gone. Any mail that doesn't fit in your box, I can put in between the screen door and the front door. Nobody can see it there. And if that area becomes too full of mail, I'll hold the rest of your mail for you until you come back into town." Now, Fred was more worried about my mail than I was. And one of the things I've talked about since is that a professional is someone who's more worried about the solutions to your problems their product or service solves than you are. That means you can entrust them implicitly because they've got your back, whether it's an accountant, whether it's a lawyer, whether it's a school teacher, a doctor. They're more worried about the solutions to your problems their product or service solves than you are. And that's how I define a professional. And Fred certainly was that kind of person. So I agree with Fred's suggestions. I promptly leave town for a couple of weeks. When I come back, I notice my doormat is missing. And I have a small front porch back then. I look around, I see my doormat's in the corner, but it's covering something. See, what had happened is UPS had misdelivered a box of mine 5 doors down, left my box on somebody else's porch. Lucky for me, Fred the Postman was on the job. Saw my box on the wrong porch, picked it up, carried it down, put it in the corner, wrote a note of explanation on it, then tried to disguise it with a doormat so nobody would take it. So not only is Fred delivering the mail, now he's picking up slack for UPS. Second thing I learned from Fred, among many things, and by the way, I just talked to Fred this morning, interestingly enough. He's retired, still lives in the area. But I learned that if you really want to create loyalty, solve problems you didn't create. Fred didn't put the box on the wrong porch, but Fred solved the problem somebody else created. So you can imagine with that kind of amazing service, Christmas rolls around, I leave a little gift in the box to express my appreciation. Now, the next day that mail gets delivered, I have an unusual letter in my mail. See, the letter has a stamp on it, but the stamp's not canceled. And I see the return address is Fred Shea, who lives in North Glen. Fred knew it was a felony to put unposted mail in a box. So even though he carried the letter from his house to my house, he still put a stamp on just to keep it legal. So after I cut the stamp off, I read the letter. The letter says, "Dear Mr. Sanborn, thank you for remembering me at Christmas. I'm flattered you talk about me in your speeches and seminars. I hope I can continue to provide exceptional service. Now, if you fast forward the tape, I met my wife in 1995. We got married. She moved in. But a couple of years later, when we were expecting our first son, we moved to Highlands Ranch, where we live today. But for almost 10 years, Fred delivered my mail and then her mail. And even if you had read the book, and by the way, anyone that wants to access that story and share it, if they go to fredfactor.com, there's a heading that says Meet Fred. And I have a written version of that story. And one of the things that trying to remember now, I got sidetracked by my own digression there.
So you guys got married, and then your wife moved in.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So we moved down to Highlands Ranch. When I wrote the book about Fred, I said there were a couple of things that even a reader wouldn't necessarily know. The first is when the book first came out, Fred had been an employee of the Postal Service for about 27 years and never been recognized by his employer. Everybody knew he was amazing, his customers, his coworkers, but nobody in management noticed. And if you want to be a good leader or a good coach, you've got to pay attention to the good things people do, recognize them, reinforce them, encourage it. And of course, the book brought that well-deserved recognition to Fred, but had the book not been written, who knows? The second thing is, you wouldn't know my favorite idea in the book. At the end of the book, there's a chapter where I talk to Fred about what motivates him. And one of my favorite lines in the book is Fred said, I lay in bed at the end of the day, I only worry about one thing. And that is, did I waste any of the day I just finished? And I summarize that. I say in my work, fear nothing but to waste the present moment. Because if you take care of the moments become your life. And it's so easy to be distracted with social media and everything that we have going on. I mean, distraction has always been easy, but it's probably easier now than it ever has been in the history of the world. And so when you can really focus on the moment, the people you're with, the things you're doing, and make the most of those moments, that's, to me, and it's proven by Fred, the key to a very successful and fulfilling life.
It's such a tremendous story, Mark. And I think everybody listening could probably hopefully name a Fred in their own life. For me, Mark, we have a gal that works at our local Target. Her name is Tanya. We call her Miss Tanya. And Miss Tanya, every single time that we go to the grocery store on the weekends, her line is full of customers. I mean, people will wait in a long line to be able to greet and see Miss Tanya because she has this energy that is contagious. Just last weekend, she was on vacation. I kid you not, Mark. Everybody's asking the employees, where is Tanya? Asking the manager, where's Miss Tanya? And that's the legacy, that's the mark that these people can leave. And I think what's so interesting is that to us, to most people, it's like it's obvious. It's doing the uncommon while being common in a common area. So I would love to know, why don't more people do this? What holds people back from being a Fred-like personality? Why is it so uncommon to run into people like this? Why isn't the world filled with more Freds?
Well, that's a great question that I've been asked a lot over the years. And, the underlying theme of all my books, but it started with the Fred factor, is that nobody can prevent you from choosing to be extraordinary. Interestingly to me, a lot of the Freds I meet were not born into great circumstances or wealth or position. These were people that in many cases really had to kind of struggle. I wrote a sequel to the Fred Factor called Fred 2.0, where I basically, with Fred's permission, share the fact that he did not have a great upbringing, didn't have parents that exemplified what he came to believe was important. And yet he became that who he was despite of, not because of. So I think when somebody says why, you talk about Tanya, I can't tell you how many times I've said that whenever a customer asks for an employee by name, that employee is a superstar. Most of the time when somebody says, well, who checked you out that day? You're like, I don't know. They were about this tall. And we really don't remember. Obviously, she, like Fred, you could write a book called The Tanya Technique. She's a superstar. But I think that what's really important, and I wish more coaches and leaders explain this to people, is it's not the job you have, but how you do the job. Fred, one of the reasons I think Fred was so well embraced is he wasn't Steve Jobs. He wasn't a tech titan. He wasn't a financial genius like Warren Buffett. He was a guy that put mail in a box, but he did the ordinary in an extraordinary way. So I'll give you three things in answer to your question. First of all, people say, can you make somebody be a friend? I don't know. I couldn't make my boys take out the garbage when they lived at home. So I'm not a big fan of making people do things, and I'm not particularly good at it. But what you can do is you can provide an environment and the inspiration and the encouragement so that people choose to be like Fred. Why aren't more people like Fred? Well, the first is awareness. It's like there's a great video. I'm sure you've seen it where it's an old black and white movie, and it says, "Count how many times the basketball bounces." And you're counting, and you get to the end, and it's 14 bounces, and then they say, "Did you see the gorilla?" And they show you that again, and when you stop focusing on the basketball, a gorilla walks across the background. You don't see what you're not looking for. And I think that the first key is awareness, being aware of the opportunities that present themselves every day. Today, my mother-in-law lives in assisted living near us, a really nice home. We went down to take her to a medical appointment, and while I was waiting in the hallway, a woman opened her door and she said, "Would you like to see my books?" Now, I had never met this woman before. I didn't know her from a box of rocks, but I thought, you know what? It's important to her. I've got a little bit of time. I looked at her books. I talked about some of her books. She showed me a picture of her deceased husband. And I'm not saying that to say, wow, what a great guy I am, because what I did was seriously simple. But when we're moving at 100 miles an hour with our hair on fire, we don't see those opportunities. And when someone says, "Would you like to see my books?" It's easy to say, "No, I'm sorry, I'm tied up right now, but thanks." And I had a little bit of time to hopefully make her day a little bit better. So the first is awareness. But the second, to me, the higher level, is intentionality. That's where you make it a point. One of the techniques I've taught my clients for many years is I call it the one-a-day principle. And that is, you can't delight every customer every time, every day. You don't have enough hours in the day to do that. That's hyperbole. The tragedy in most businesses and organizations isn't that we don't delight everybody, but that we go weeks or months without delighting anybody. So if you got a team of 10 people and everybody on that team says, today, every day, we're going to do a good job for everybody. We're committed to excellence, but we're going to look for a vendor or a customer or a coworker or a stranger for that matter. We're going to do something really out of the ordinary for. Doesn't have to cost any money, doesn't have to take much time, but that little extra. And that's the thing about extraordinary. People think extra is huge. Extra means a little bit. Quantum leap. We say quantum leaps are big deals. They're the smallest movement an atom can make. It's the result of the movement that's big, not the movement itself. And so I would say the two keys to being Fred-like, and I know that the language is silly and I don't get hung up on whether you call it Fred-like or whatever, extraordinary, whatever word you choose, is first of all to be aware of opportunities, and secondly, to look for opportunities, to say, I'm going to try to find, and if you do this with customers and coworkers, you're going to become legendary without even trying, because it happens so seldom to so few people.
I would love to get into maybe what prevents someone from being a Fred. And I know a lot of listeners, that's not who they are, but maybe they know somebody who's kind of in this boat, Mark. It's like, hey, why would I do that? I don't get paid for that. Or that's not my job. Or maybe an athlete. Well, I'm not the team captain. Or maybe the assistant coach. I'm not the head coach. Why should I be doing those things? I could see those being some of the excuses and some of the myths out there. What do you say to people like that who say, hey, that's not my job?
Well, what do you do? The short answer is because you can. It's a more fun way to live. I think that people always assume that doing those kinds of things, the only person that benefits is the recipient. It doesn't happen as much, but in days of old, traffic cops in cities would direct traffic. And a lot of times they were cranky and they were blowing their whistle and waving their baton, trying to get people to the intersection. But every once in a while, if you're old enough, you'll remember the cop that had headphones on and was doing a little dance and having some fun with the gestures. And it brought a smile to the face of the people driving through, even though they were exposed to him for 5 or 10 seconds. Now, you could say that was a Fred-like thing, but let me ask you a question. I got to believe that when you're a traffic cop, this isn't a reward for being an exemplary law enforcement officer. I got to believe it's kind of grunt work. Who knows? Maybe it's assigned as kind of a punishment. I have no idea. But you can either suffer through your shift or you can enjoy your shift. So do they have to do that? Of course not. But I got to believe that the cop that's having fun is doing it as much or more for him or herself as they are for the drivers in the other cars. So first of all, it's just a more interesting, fun way to live. But the second thing is that um, we do things that we want to do, and those are easy. But discipline comes from doing things that are hard to do. And nobody develops discipline or muscle. You know, muscles develop through resistance, right? Nobody develops muscle without resistance. One of my friends once said, "You know, I just realized what I pay my personal trainer to do. I pay him to create resistance." And I thought, isn't that an interesting concept in life? You know, we often, unless we have a coach, we don't have anybody to create resistance. And we grew up in an environment that said, take the path of least resistance. Now, sometimes that makes sense, but at other times, sometimes you take the path of more resistance so that you develop the integrity and the fortitude and the discipline to be better. If you only do what you're paid to do, you'll never get paid anymore to do anymore. And that's a good reason to accept more responsibility. You don't get promoted just because you showed up every day. You don't get become captain of the team just because you were a good team member. The captain of the team is a good team member who also was a good team leader, and you become a good team leader while you're a member, and that's why they then make you the official leader. So those are just some aspects of why. Oh, and there is one thing I need to mention. I once read that a cynic is an idealist that was disappointed. I believe a lot of people started out kind of naturally doing these things, but they weren't rewarded, they weren't recognized. I've met people who said, I used to be that way, and my coworkers told me, knock it off, you're making the rest of us look bad. So I think there's a certain punishment that mediocrity brings from other people who only ever want to be mediocre. And the person that told me this about their coworkers telling them, you're making us look bad is, so whose life are you going to lead? Your coworker's life or your life? You got to choose to do what makes sense to you, not what makes sense to others. So I think there are some potential Freds that have simply not been rewarded or recognized, and as a result become cynical.
You've been traveling the world speaking for the last 40 years with this Fred-like lens, Mark. I'd be curious. I'd love to just hear a couple maybe low-hanging fruits that some of my audience, what have been some of the most impactful actions that people can take to be more like Fred? What are some just small things that you've noticed traveling the world, meeting Freds, and just being in different conference rooms? Like, what are some small things that actually go a long ways that my audience can start doing?
Well, first, and I alluded to it, and that is slow down. I was getting off an airplane, and there was a young person pushing a wheelchair, an employee of the airport, and the person in the wheelchair, they were having trouble getting the wheelchair over the jetway. The jetway has like a metal lip where it expands and contracts. And I'm thinking, wow, they should have hired somebody stronger. And I said, excuse me. And I started to like kind of edge around. And the guy behind me says to the person pushing the wheelchair, can I help? And it was like an explosion in my head, because what I saw was an obstacle, but the person behind me saw an opportunity. So a lot of times obstacles, and Ryan Holiday wrote, an existentialist kind of a book, actually Stoic book called The Obstacle is the Way. And so it reminded me of that the difference between an obstacle and an opportunity is simply perspective. Same circumstance. It's just how you look at it. So if you're, again, like I was, and this is not a great reflection on me at the time, or some of the times when I get caught up and moving quickly, then you don't see those opportunities to be of service. The other thing is just pay attention to people. We tend to be pretty insular. In an airport, I say that the greatest danger is somebody with their nose stuck to their iPhone careening off me like a billiard ball, right? Not looking where they're going. If you just start looking around, you'll see opportunities to help people do things. And again, not hard opportunities, just a silly one that over the years is still a great thing to do is if somebody's trying to do a selfie of 6 people, and very few of us have arms long enough to capture 6 people, offer to take the picture for them. It takes about 14 seconds, and it makes the picture a little better, and it makes those six people's day a little bit better. So I would go back to what I said earlier about awareness and intentionality. If you can't see opportunities, then try to create opportunities. One of my favorites, I'm the leadership expert in residence at High Point University. And if anyone is ever in High Point, which is the furniture capital of the world, they should tour High Point University. It's the most extraordinary campus I've ever seen anywhere in the world. And my friend, Dr. Nito Cubain, is the president. I'm the leadership expert in residence, and I go there frequently. But for some reason, there's a restaurant I dine at there, the steakhouse, that I never can remember where it's located. And so it was, I think, January. It was kind of cold and maybe a little rainy. And I was trying to find the steakhouse, and I saw a student, and I said, hey, I've been there before, but I forgot. Can you point me towards the steakhouse? He goes, hey, I'll tell you what, I'm kind of going that direction. I'll take you. And he walked with me to the signage so that he knew I wasn't going to get lost yet again. Now, he wasn't going to the steakhouse. He was just kind of going in that general direction. For all I know, he was going the opposite direction, but he was being helpful. And in the book, I call that ABCD, above and beyond the call of duty. He could have just said, you know what, go to that street, hang a left. When you get to the statue, turn right, you'll find. He took me there. A little bit extra is what makes people extraordinary. ABCD, above and beyond the call of duty.
That's fantastic. I love this. So a lot of this so far is about, leading yourself, being more like Fred. We have a lot of leaders and coaches tuning in. So if we were to kind of turn the page a little bit and talk a little bit more about leading others, I'll start with just a very open-ended question, and feel free, Mark, to take this kind of where you want. But I'd be curious, on 40 years working with leaders, traveling the country, what's the biggest struggle that you see leaders facing today, and how are you helping them overcome that struggle?
Well, I don't have quantitative analysis, but I've got anecdotal evidence that there are a couple of things that are very difficult. When I wrote my book, The Intention Imperative, which came out in 2019, just before COVID, and I wondered if my book would still be relevant after COVID. And the good news is, because I always try to write principle-based books, the principles still apply. But I basically said that because I started thinking about what are the irreducible minimums of leadership. I always like to think in terms of irreducible minimums because those are foundational. And I believe that, with the exception of, one-trick ponies, one-hit wonders, the leader that just gets lucky, the person that wins the lotto ticket, that wasn't skill at amassing money. It was just fortuitous luck. If you get past that, there are two things that make any leader successful. The first is being crystal clear on what they're trying to achieve. And again, that goes back to the idea of focus and overcoming distraction and being led off course. Very hard to do. So number one, and by the way, if you as a leader aren't crystal clear on what you're trying to accomplish, your team isn't either. It has to start with the leader. And if a leader, and I've seen this, I call it management philosophy du jour. If a leader reads a book and suddenly changes direction, and then they read another book and they go yet another direction, eventually employees quit trying because they know the next leadership book is going to change the course of the organization yet again. So number one is being crystal clear on what you're trying to accomplish. And number two is spending the majority of every day doing it. It's one thing to know, it's another thing to do. And when you combine clarity with action, daily action, that's what I call the intention imperative. You can't have one without the other. You've got to have both. If you have no vision, but you take a lot of action every day, you're like the Tasmanian devil in the cartoon. A lot of dust and dirt flying, but little to show for it. So that's what I think is one of the biggest challenges. The irreducible minimums of leadership is being crystal clear on what you're trying to accomplish, and then doing the right things. And that's the other thing I said, taking action every day, taking action, doing the right things to achieve it. The intention imperative. The second thing I think a lot of leaders struggle with is they try to get more done by working longer hours. You eventually run out of hours to work. It affects your psyche. It affects your well-being. So I always focus leaders on capacity. Capacity is the ability to accomplish more with the same amount of time. And capacity is increased through a lot of things. Number one is through learning. becoming better at whatever it is you do, whether it's leading or selling or customer service. And then it also comes from eliminating the low priority and superfluous things from your schedule that someone else could do, usually someone at a lower level, someone at a lower pay scale. And that's really the key. You can't just, if you're getting more done by working longer hours, that's a dead end street. Capacity is the ability to get more done in the same amount of time because, as the old cliche says, you've sharpened your saw, you've increased your skill set, you've become more focused on doing the important things.
I recently had a conversation with a college football coach, and it kind of brings me to that first point about being crystal clear about what you're trying to achieve. I think when you first hear that, it's like, okay, it's obvious. Let's be crystal clear about what we want. It's not so obvious. There are a lot of coaches out there who aren't crystal clear about where they want to go. Maybe they ultimately know where they want to go, but what are the steps that are going to get me to get to that point? Anyway, talking to this coach, I thought this was brilliant. I want to get your thoughts on it. One of the things he said was during football practice, occasionally he'd go up into the press box and watch the practice from the press box. Now, he'd do it for two reasons. One, he said he could get more clarity and it would get less noisy. So he'd go from the field, he'd get away from it, there'd be nobody else in the press box, and then he'd be able to see clearly and not have any voices or distraction. I thought it was a great parallel for leaders out there. What a great lesson. Physically, yes, back yourself out from practice, being able to see more things at once, but what a great practice to implement every single day. What are the ways that you're stepping away to create more awareness so that you're not always right here? When I'm 3 inches away from the action, sometimes it's hard to see clearly because I'm so close to it. So I thought it
Yeah.
was brilliant on being able to step away, look at things from a bigger picture, and then what did you learn? Now go down and tell your assistant coaches on what you learned by seeing things from a different angle. So if you were to kind of play that sports analogy with me, have you seen that in your line of work too? And what do you think about the ability of stepping back in order to ultimately step forward?
Well, to be visionary means big picture. And I think leaders have, kind of almost diametrically opposed challenges. One is to be philosophical. That's the 30,000-foot press box view. But the other is the ability to get granular because some people have the ability to kind of envision things but not achieve things. Other people have the ability to achieve things that others have envisioned. And I think that the best leaders can do both. I think sometimes, though, I've seen in organizations of all kinds that they're kind of two different groups. That there are some leaders that are the visionary and they surround themselves with a team that's really good at execution. Or if a person is really good at execution, they align themselves with a really powerful project or a really visionary leader. I think what you were talking about with that coach, I wrote about one of my books. I was reading about a magician that was on TV. And whoever was watching had shared this story in a letter to the editor of a magazine. He was really tired. He just got home from work. So he's watching this magic show and he laid down and was watching it from a different perspective. And he started to be able to see how the tricks were done. And so I say, if you want to increase your knowledge and expertise, change your perspective. Instead of looking at magic as oriented this way, by laying down, you can see things you don't see with that horizontal or with that vertical orientation. And I think that's very similar to what you were talking about with that football coach.
Yeah, I was recently at a Minnesota Twins game with my mentor Brian Kane, who works one-on-one with about 60 or 70 Major League Baseball players. And it was so cool because what we did was for the first 2 innings, we sat about 12 rows behind the plate. And then after that, for next 2 innings, we went over to third baseline. And then we went up to the corner of the stadium. And I go, Brian, what are we doing up here? He goes, watch, we'll find something up here that we couldn't have seen down there. And wouldn't you know it, we saw a process from one of his catchers that he wasn't able to get his cleats in. And it was just like, what a moment to be able to look at things through a different perspective with proximity and also with your mindset. Can you look at things through different angles and pick up on different things that you wouldn't normally see by seeing things right in front of you? What a great piece of advice.
Well, I would give your listeners, your viewers, some homework, and it's probably not going to be hard because I'm guessing the majority will already be familiar with the Savannah Bananas.
Mm-hmm.
The owner of that team is my friend Jesse Cole. I wrote about him in my book, The Intention Imperative. He started, I think the Bananas started in 17. I wrote about him in 2019. Now, everything I wrote about back then is still valid, but amplified by a factor of 100. Because one of the interesting things about Jesse is he is a lover of baseball. He was a baseball coach. And if you've watched, I've seen at least 2 or 3 major network TV specials. But Jesse said when he was coaching collegiate summer ball, he was bored. And he thought, if I'm bored, the audience is bored. Not only did he, when I met him, he had reinvented the trappings of baseball. What happened as you entered the stadium? What happened in the parking lot? What happened before the game? What happened in between the innings? But now he's created banana ball, which is a different form of baseball. For instance, as you probably know, the game only goes 2 hours. There's no such thing as a walk. What is a walk is a very different kind of an experience that's really cool to watch. And so I always love to find successful people and direct people who want to be successful to observe them. Jesse's written, I think, 2 books now. My book talks about both High Point and the Savannah Bananas and 3 other organizations, the Intention Imperative. So I would recommend that people study Jesse Cole. When Jesse first started the Bananas, he had one challenge, and that is these college players weren't being paid. They literally were in Savannah living in people's homes, kind of like exchange students, in my view. And he said to himself, how am I going to get them to do the dances and to perform? And you know what he found that was fascinating? This goes back to what we were talking about earlier. Why do it? They loved it. It wasn't like a hard sell. He didn't have to like beat somebody. It's like once they saw what they could do, they loved doing it. And now, you know, from the dancing umpire to the firefighters and the bananas dancing and all their shenanigans, it's become baseball on steroids.
When I think about athletics, Mark, I think about mindset and skill set. You have to have both. When I think about coaching, I think you have to have a task mind and a relationship mind. You have to be able to be task oriented. These are the things we need to do, X's and O's. You also need to be relationship driven. Otherwise, nobody's really going to care what you have to say. Business owners could probably be the same way. You got to know your numbers, but you got to also know how to market. What I'm trying to say is there's 2 different sides of the coin if you want to be elite. If we were to zoom in on coaches, and if you agree with that, I would love to hear, how do you help leaders and specifically coaches or team captains balance that dichotomy of task and relationship? The best ones can do a little bit of both, I think, and sometimes the ones that struggle are on either end of the spectrum. Is it impossible to be good at both? And how do you go about that?
No, it's not impossible. It's very hard. Research that I've cited in the past, they looked at that balance and they found out that managers tended to be high on one or the other, but that the percentage of managers that were good at both was about 1%, 1 out of 100. And I've always said that is the greatest challenge of leadership, is how you balance relationship and results. If you focus too much on results, you become a tyrant. If you focus only on relationships, you become a good old boy or a good old gal with no
That's right.
results to show. So that is one of the great challenges of leadership. And it goes back to first being aware of it, because we all tend to act in ways that we've been conditioned to act. If you came up through an organization with a taskmaster, you were probably a taskmaster, unless you were one of those people that said, you know what, I'm never going to be that way. And that happens as well. If you're really relational, you're going to be heavy on the relationship and wonder why your career doesn't progress. So you've always got to be looking at that. It's a tension, if you will, because they're opposing things. And here's the thing: if you do not maintain the relationship, you won't get the results. If you are a taskmaster, you have high turnover, you have demoralized, unengaged employees, and low productivity. So yes, perhaps you are getting results, but you're paying a high price for it. I wrote a book called You Don't Need a Title to Be a Leader. And it's interesting because most of my audiences are titled leaders. If I ever rewrite the book, I'm going to call it You Don't Need a Title to Be a Leader, but if you have a title, it won't screw you up if you do it right. And what I talk about in the book is I quote Philip of Macedonia. May not be a familiar name, but that was Alexander the Great's father. who said an army of deer led by a lion is more to be feared than an army of lions led by a deer. And the reason I quote him is because I don't think he got it right. I think an army of lions led by a lion is to be feared most of all. So instead of saying, you know what, I want a lion leader and we'll get those deers to, into shape, or we've got a deer leader and the lions don't know what to do, I think what you want is a strong leader at the top and untitled leaders at every level, which begs the question, how do you do that? And it comes very close to what you just said. It's about know what and know how. Now, the know-how are the skills. Any skill that creates commitment is a leadership skill. Compliance is not a leadership skill. Commitment is because people want to do something, because you've inspired, encouraged them to do it, motivated them. Commitment's an easy way to get it done. That's carrot and stick. If you don't do it, you'll suffer. If you do it, you'll get rewarded. So there's no reason why every employee in an organization couldn't understand or shouldn't know the skills of leadership. And I very specifically wrote about that in the book. But the second thing they've got to know is, when is it appropriate to lead? In other words, what do I do? Because an untitled leader doesn't have the same responsibilities as a titled leader. So to make it at least a little easier, I say that all leaders increase ROI. Now, in accounting, we call that return on investment. But in leadership, I repurpose the 3 letters so it's easy to remember: relationships, outcomes, and improvements. So anytime you can build a better relationship with a customer or a vendor, that's an act of leadership. Anytime you can create an outcome that wouldn't have existed, or you make the outcome better, that's an act of leadership. And then that leads us to the I, which is improvement. Improvement is taking something and making it a little bit better. So I can't think of a sane leader or manager that would say to their employees, I don't want you building better relationships. I don't want you focused on positive outcomes. And if you have good ideas on how to do it better, don't tell me. I mean, that's nonsensical. So again, it's about know what, relationship, outcomes, and improvements, and know how. Because again, it's a theme. One of the primary reasons why people don't do what we want them to do is they don't know how. Nito Kubain at High Point says, expectation without education equals frustration.
Say that one more time, Mark. That's good.
Expectation without education equals frustration. You can expect somebody to do something. If they don't know how, it doesn't matter how motivated they are, they're going to be frustrated. So you've got to provide both expectation and education. And that is the expectation. We want you all to lead regardless of title. And here's how to do it.
I got a silly question, but I think there might be some people that might be curious about this. For my task-oriented coaches who want to be a more relationship-driven coach, my obvious and maybe silly question would be, what are 1 or 2 steps that they can do to be a more relationship-driven coach? How can they improve the relationship with the athletes on their team? What does that look like? What are some easy things that they could do if they notice, man, I am way on this side of the spectrum. I'd like to be more on this side. What should I do, Mark?
Well, I always hate to say it goes without saying, because if you say that, you shouldn't say it. But if you don't fundamentally like the people you lead, doesn't mean you approve of everything they do, doesn't mean you drink beer with them, doesn't mean you hang out with them on the weekends. But if you don't fundamentally like people or the people you lead, you're probably not going to be a very successful leader or a very successful coach. Now, assuming that and I think that the entry level to leadership is concern for the people who are doing the work as well as the work that's getting done. I'll go back to something Fred the Postman said. I said to him, I said, Fred, how are you able to give such great service to all the customers on your route? And Fred said, well, first of all, I don't think I'm his customers. I thought that was interesting. So you might ask the question, how do I become more relational with all of the people I coach? Fred said, I don't think I'm his customers. I think of them as friends. And it's easy to be nice to your friends. Now, Fred didn't say, I'm friends with all of them. There's a big difference between treating people like friends and being everyone's friend. Friendship takes a big investment of time and energy. So you're not going to be everybody's friend. But if you think about them, I'll give you a silly example. I'm the only guy that drives the right speed in Denver. If you're in front of me, you're going too slow. If you're behind me, you're going too fast. I am the standard by which speed should be determined, the correct speed. And every once in a while, my wife Darla is a much nicer person than I am. I will blow my horn, right? And she'll say, don't do that. They could be going to the hospital. They could have a sick child. But if I blow my horn and the person looks up in the rearview mirror and it's my friend Shoop, all of a sudden I'm not shaking my fist. I'm waving like, "Hey, buddy, how are you?" Now he's still a bad driver. But what changed was how I treated him because he went from a stranger to a friend. If you treat people like friends, you give them the benefit of the doubt and you treat them more nicely, you treat them more relationally. I think you asked for a kind of a specific thing, a task oriented leader can do. And I would say inquire more into the feelings. Now, I'm not a psychotherapist or a shrink, but I do know that one of the keys to good therapy is inquiry, not statement. And when somebody's struggling, it's one thing to say, well, the reason you're struggling is because you're not doing this as well or as much or as often as you should. It's to ask about, well, how do you feel when you try to do that? How do you feel when you succeed? How do you feel when you fail? What do you feel is missing? And even though life is a mix of soft and hard, of emotion and behavior, but I think that we become more relational when we inquire into the lives of the people that we lead.
That's right. I ran across this quote of yours when you talk about friends. I think it has a lot of weight to it. I'd love for you to break it down. You said, "When you're a leader, many will befriend you, but not all will be your friend." I'll say that one more time. When you're a leader, many will befriend you, but not all will be your friend. Can you take some time breaking that down?
John, I got that from John Ashcroft. I don't know if anybody remembers John Ashcroft, politician many years ago, and I experienced it a little bit when I was president of the National Speakers Association. When you are a leader, you usually have the ability to do nice things for people that other people couldn't do for them. When I was president of the National Speakers Association, one of the things I influenced was who got to speak and be on main stage and get the spotlight. And I'm glad I had read the Ashcroft quote. And this is true in all organizations, but I experienced it in mine. All of a sudden, I had people that I didn't know were my friends. I mean, they were super nice and they were very attentive and they checked in with me often. And I remember thinking, well, when I stopped being president, those people disappeared. Now, my friends were still my friends. I didn't lose any friends as far as I know, but I also didn't make a lot of new friends. And so we have to understand that leadership attracts not just through personality, but through power. And you want to make sure that you don't get duped and think you're helping out a friend when really you're being manipulated by a player.
Any advice on how to decipher through that, how to work through that, how to know if it's real or fake?
Oh, yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I don't think I'd get an A plus in intuition because I've been duped many times. But I think part of it is to dig around for motive. I also think that one of the tests of friendship is being able to tell people the truth without them getting angry about it. If somebody said to me, "Well, I'd really like to be on the winter program," and I'd say, "Well, the winter program, we've already got all of our speakers chosen." If they had an attitude about that, then I knew that they were basically trying to use the power that I had to get on the program. It's the people that I liked were the people that said, I just want to serve. I'll do whatever. You need somebody to direct people, set up chairs. You need somebody to run a committee behind the scenes. And that's, I guess, the other thing is that true friends are more interested in serving than shining. They're more interested in the greater good than they are their individual good.
I close down my podcast, Mark, with a similar question for coaches and leaders. And the question is this: what's the greatest piece of advice that a coach or a mentor has given to you? And how do you try to carry that in your personal or professional life?
Well, I'll maybe cheat and give you more than one
Please
because
do.
it's really hard. Great advice is somewhat circumstantial or conditional. I once heard something that has saved me a lot of brain damage. I don't know who originally said it. I remember one of the people that repeated it, and that is, if it begins in a hassle, it ends in a hassle. Generally, teams, relationships, processes don't get simpler as they go along. They become more challenging and or complex and or conflicted. So I think that one of the signs of a potentially bad deal is it starts in a hassle. And that advice has saved me a lot as an investor, as someone who has been a leader in both businesses and organizations. I've tried to live by that. When I was I was in high school. For some odd reason, I met with a state senator from Ohio, where I'm from. And I asked him, because my interest initially was in public speaking and that evolved into leadership. I asked him, what's the best advice you could give me about public speaking? And I've always remembered what he said. He said, remember, whenever you speak, whether it's a eulogy or a presentation at church or a business meeting, people want to be entertained. And I've morphed that a little bit, because I'm not sure these many years later I would agree with entertainment, but I would agree with engaged. It's hard to think about, and I've heard some entertaining eulogies, but more important than entertaining is they were respectful and engaging. In other words, it wasn't superfluous. I think sometimes entertainment is, we entertain for its own entertainment in its own right. I think the key to good communicating is to get people interested. And that advice, like I said, even though it's morphed a little bit over the intervening 55 years, I think that's pretty good advice. And then the final thing that I have to bring myself back to, and this is kind of circular to what we said earlier, and that is fear nothing but to waste the present moment, because it's so easy to let worry and difficulties and distractions take you off course. And I think being intentional and trying to, to the degree you can, not sounding like a game show host, is make the most of every moment, or make the most you can of a situation. I got one other thing I'm going to share with you.
Keep it going.
I hope people that are interested read me on LinkedIn, because I'm not planning to write any more books after 8, but I do post weekly on LinkedIn. I'm very easy to find if anyone's interested. I heard a guy probably 40 years ago. I know he's still alive. I think he still lives in Aspen, but he was a martial artist who used martial arts as a teaching tool. And his name is Tom Crone. I tried to reach out to his office to thank them for something he said 40 years ago. Unfortunately, I don't know that my message ever got through, but he told this story about this guy who's walking too close to the edge of a cliff and slips over, and he's plummeting to certain death, but he grabs a root that's sticking out of the side of the mountain, and he's clinging to this root for dear life. And he sees growing on the side of the mountain next to the root a strawberry, and he picks the strawberry and he eats it, and he says, delicious. And I'll never forget that, because isn't life like that? Some days we feel like we're hanging on, and there's a strawberry and we ignore it, or there's a blessing and we don't appreciate it. And I think that one of the highest forms of life is to be able to deal with very difficult situations and still not ignore them, but still enjoy the strawberries that present themselves in the midst of the situation.
What a great place to end. Mark Sanborn, everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. How can my listeners best support you?
MarkSanborn.com is the mothership if they want to see videos or read art. I've got over 1,000 articles I've written. And like I said, if they want kind of my current thinking and writing, hook up with me on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark. I really appreciate you.
Thank you.